For years, Stella had lived in a quiet surrender, believing that merely surviving was enough. She had become an expert at blending into the background, at silencing her own needs and desires. She no longer asked herself what she truly wanted or what she truly felt. The chaos of her past, the pain she had endured, had left her with only one priority: to get through each day without being noticed. The apartment that once felt like a sanctuary had turned into a prison of self-imposed exile. The space felt smaller with each passing day, suffocating her, trapping her within its four walls. Every inch of that apartment seemed to whisper reminders of her defeat. The faded curtains that never let the sunlight in, the pile of unopened bills on the coffee table, the solitary teacup sitting on the windowsill, all of these were symbols of a life put on hold, of a woman who had ceased to exist for herself. The light that once sparkled in her eyes, a light full of hope, ambition, and love, had gradually dimmed, as though it had been extinguished by the weight of everything she had endured. Fear had become her constant companion. It lingered in every corner of her mind, settling in the spaces where joy and peace once lived. It was no longer a fleeting emotion, but a permanent presence that dictated the rhythm of her days. Fear shaped how she moved, how she spoke, even how she thought. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of the future, the fear of everything and nothing. It was the fear of ever trying again, of stepping out and taking a risk. She no longer believed in second chances. She had tried to build a life once. She had opened her heart to love, to trust, to hope. But the man she had chosen to share her life with had turned those dreams into a nightmare. From the beginning, there were small signs that something wasn't right: his controlling behavior, his need to monitor her every move. But at first, she thought it was love. She thought it was his way of caring for her, of wanting to protect her. How naive she had been. As the months passed, the signs became clearer, the cracks in the relationship more obvious. The small gestures of love turned into accusations. The concern over her well-being turned into distrust. It was like living in a house of mirrors, every reflection of herself distorted by the weight of his words. "Do you think I don't know where you've been?" he would ask, his voice dripping with suspicion. "You think I don't see the lies you tell me?" The sting of his words would cut deep, deeper than she ever imagined. She couldn't understand how she had gone from being his partner to being his prisoner. The accusations were relentless. He would go through her phone, her emails, her messages. Every call, every conversation became a potential betrayal. He would question her friends, accuse them of being a bad influence, of pulling her away from him. At first it was subtle, just a few words here and there that made her question herself. But as time wore on, it became louder, more aggressive. She would tiptoe around him, trying to avoid his wrath, doing everything she could to avoid upsetting him. But the most terrifying part wasn't the verbal abuse. It was the silence. The moments when he would go cold, shutting her out completely, leaving her to wonder what had gone wrong. She never knew if she was about to be scolded or punished, or if he would just completely withdraw, leaving her alone in the void of his indifference. And then came the days when his temper would flare. It wasn't always physical. He never hit her, at least not in the way she feared. But his hands would rise in anger, threatening to strike her without ever doing so. The way he would grab her wrist tightly, his fingers digging into her skin, the way his gaze would darken, making her feel small and insignificant. That was when the realization struck her like a thunderbolt. She couldn't live like this anymore. This wasn't love. This was fear. And it was consuming her. It wasn't just the emotional toll that wore her down. It was the physical exhaustion that came from living in a constant state of alert. Every time the phone rang, every time she heard footsteps outside the door, her heart would race. She would jump at the slightest noise. She would curl into herself, bracing for the next outburst, the next confrontation. It was inescapable. Her body had grown weaker from the stress, her mind clouded with worry. She felt like a shell of the person she used to be, a woman who had once believed in herself, in love, in the future. The breaking point came one Wednesday morning. Stella woke up with a heavy heart, the weight of her decision pressing down her like a mountain. She knew it was time. She couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine when, in reality, her world was crumbling. She packed a small suitcase, only the essentials. She didn't need anything more. A few clothes, some important documents, and the old photograph of her parents who had passed away years ago. She walked out that door without looking back. It wasn't easy. Leaving the life she had known, the man she had once loved, was one of the hardest decisions she had ever made. But in that moment, she understood that she had to save herself. She had to reclaim the parts of herself that had been buried under the weight of fear and hurt. She cut ties with everything she knew. She quit her job, changed her phone number, and left her life behind. But even in her departure, she could never truly escape. Her ex wouldn't let her go that easily. He began sending her messages, leaving notes on her door, tracking her down through friends. Stella had expected the silence to bring her peace. But instead, it only amplified the emptiness she had been avoiding. She was alone, truly alone for the first time in years, and it felt both liberating and terrifying. The nights were the hardest, filled with memories she had buried deep inside her. The mornings were just as bleak, waking up to the realization that everything had changed, that there was no going back. She had become a stranger to herself. Stella was 32 years old, but in the mirror she saw someone much older. Her face had aged, her body had withered, and her spirit had dimmed. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity and wonder, now seemed distant and hollow. But the silence of her apartment, the stillness that surrounded her, wasn't enough to drown out the voices in her head, and that's when her friends arrived. Marina and Louisa, determined to pull her out of the darkness, showed up at her door. One Friday. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't give her a choice. They walked in, bags in hand, their expressions filled with resolve. "No more hiding," Marina said, throwing open the curtains, letting the sunlight flood the room. Louisa, ever the practical one, was already rifling through Stella's closet, picking out something that might fit her. The decision was made. "We're going out for lunch," Louisa announced. Stella didn't argue. She didn't fight them. What else could she do? For the first time in months, someone had made a decision for her, and it felt like a small step towards something more. She let them take her out, not knowing what would happen, but knowing that it was time to take that first step. The restaurant was a small, cozy place, Cano Dono. It wasn't much by way of extravagance. The exposed brick walls gave the space a rustic charm, and the checkered tablecloths brought a sense of warmth, like an embrace that wrapped around you. The air was rich with the scent of tomato sauce and fresh basil, the familiar comforting aroma of Italian cooking. The gentle murmur of conversations around her blended with the soft strains of Italian music, creating a quiet but lively atmosphere. For Stella, it was a strange feeling. She hadn't been out in weeks, and the world outside her apartment felt like a foreign land. She had grown so accustomed to the stillness of her home that the buzz of the restaurant seemed almost too much. The chatter, the clinking of cutlery, the soft laughter, everything felt so loud, so alive. Yet, as strange as it was also oddly comforting. It was a sound she hadn't heard in a long time. It was as though the noise was filling up the emptiness that had taken root inside her. She sat at the table, staring down at her plate of pasta. She didn't have much of an appetite, she hadn't in months, but she picked up her fork and took the first bite. It felt almost like an obligation. The forkful of pasta didn't seem like food to her. It was just something to do, something to pass the time. The second bite was no easier, and the third was barely noticeable. But then something shifted. The flavor-rich, warm, and comforting finally broke through the fog that had clouded her senses for so long. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The small, simple act of eating felt like a victory. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to enjoy something. However small. Marina, sitting across from her, smiled softly. "You will be okay," she said, her voice filled with a quiet assurance. She reached across the table and placed her hand gently on Stella's. It was a small gesture, but one that carried with it a promise of friendship, of support, of not being alone in this. Stella nodded, though she didn't fully believe it. It was hard to believe in anything after all the darkness she had lived through. But for a brief moment, something inside her shifted, just enough to make her hold on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. That hope, fragile as it was, had begun to sprout in the most unexpected of places. A simple lunch with two friends in a small restaurant. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the days that followed, Marina and Louisa kept their promise. They didn't let Stella retreat into her shell. They kept showing up, taking her out, encouraging her to step out of the shadows. And Stella, though hesitant at first, found herself slowly acclimating to the rhythm of life outside her apartment. Even when her friends went back to their daily routines, Stella began to find solace in the small rituals they had started. She began visiting Cano Dono alone, occupying a discreet corner table. It was strange at first to be surrounded by strangers, to be part of a world that no longer seemed familiar. But the routine began to soothe her, a small tether to the outside. World. Mr. Yeppe, the owner of the restaurant, quickly recognized her. He was a kind, older man with a warm smile that made everyone feel welcome. He began to reserve a spot for her in the corner by the small shelf with old books and black and white photographs of Italy. It became her place, her quiet corner of the world. The familiarity of the restaurant, the soft murmur of the patrons, the gentle clink of glasses, everything seemed to slowly chip away at the walls Stella had built around herself. The simple act of being around people, even if she didn't interact with them, helped. The noise, the laughter, the soft hum of conversation, it began to fill the hollow space inside her. It wasn't the loud, frantic noise of chaos. It was the soft, constant hum of life happening around her. And for the first time in months, she felt like she was part of it. One evening, as Stella sipped her tea and stared out the window, she was startled by a light touch on her shoulder. It was an unexpected gesture, one that made her shiver involuntarily. She turned around and saw a man standing beside her table. He was tall, with dark hair graying slightly at the temples, and his eyes were a soft, warm brown. He was dressed simply in a navy blue sweater, but there was a quiet elegance to him, an air of calm that immediately put her at ease. "Sorry for the scare," he said with a deep but gentle voice. "I called a few times, but I guess you didn't hear with all the noise." Stella blinked, her heart racing slightly, still not used to such direct interactions. She quickly regained her composure, though, trying to push down the unease that rose within her. The man continued, explaining that the restaurant was full and there were no more tables available. "Would it be too inconvenient if I shared this table with you?" he asked, his tone respectful and soft. "I promise to be discreet." Her instincts, shaped by years of fear and self-protection, screamed for her to decline. She wanted to hide, to retreat to her corner where nothing could hurt her. But then her eyes flicked to Mr. Yeppe, who was watching from a distance. He gave her a small nod, a silent encouragement. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With a deep breath, she nodded back. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man Alexander, as he introduced himself, sat down across from her. His presence, while initially disconcerting, soon became a strange source of comfort. He ordered lasagna and a glass of red wine, and, after a brief exchange of pleasantries, pulled out a paperback book from his coat. It was an old, well-loved copy of a novel. He began to read quietly, respecting her space, never pushing for conversation. He seemed content to let her be, as if he understood that she wasn't yet ready for anything more. Stella didn't speak much, but she found herself watching him, curious. There was something about him, his calm demeanor, the way he seemed at ease in the world, that intrigued her. She didn't know why, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to retreat. She didn't feel threatened. She simply existed. And for that moment, it was enough. When Alexander finished his meal, he looked up from his book and gave her a soft smile. "It was a pleasure to share this table with you, Stella," he said simply. Stella nodded, feeling a strange warmth in her chest. She paid for her meal and left the restaurant that night feeling oddly lighter, though she couldn't quite explain why. In the following days, things remained quiet between them. But every time Stella returned to the restaurant, she would spot Alexander sitting at a distant table, always acknowledging her presence with a subtle wave, never imposing, never intruding. It was a rhythm she grew to appreciate, a silent understanding. Between them, as the days turned into weeks, their routine continued. Stella would visit Cano Dono, sitting alone at her corner table, and Alexander would be there, a quiet presence in the background. It was a strange comfort to her, this unspoken connection between them. And though they rarely spoke, something inside Stella shifted. One afternoon, Amelia, the gray-haired waitress who always served her, leaned in slightly and with a knowing smile asked, "Would you like to try the tiramisu today, dear?" Stella felt a flush creep up her neck, her face warming under the attention. But before she could respond, Amelia pointed discreetly to Alexander at his table. "He asked if you'd like to try it. He says it's the best here, but you never order it." The surprise of his attention, even in such a small thing, took Stella off guard. She hadn't expected him to remember, to care enough to notice what she did or didn't order. She smiled, feeling an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. "Okay," she said, her voice softer than she intended. And so, for the first time in months, Stella found herself trying something new. She let herself be open to something, a small gesture, an unexpected kindness, and it was the beginning of something that would change her life forever. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Stella's life began to take on a new rhythm, one that felt more natural, more comfortable. She no longer spent her time hiding in the shadows of her apartment. With every step outside, with every new interaction, she began to piece together the broken fragments of herself. She was no longer just surviving, she was living. The healing process was slow, a delicate dance of rediscovery and courage, but with each day, she felt a little more like the woman she had once been. Her visits to Cano Dono became a routine she looked forward to. Each time she entered, the warm, familiar atmosphere of the restaurant greeted her like an old friend. The smell of tomato sauce, the murmur of conversations, the soft clinking of glasses, all of it felt like home now. And each time, as if by an unspoken agreement, Alexander would be there. Sometimes he was sitting at his usual table, engrossed in a book. Other times he would glance up and offer her a quiet, respectful smile. It was always gentle, never rushed, never imposing. They didn't speak much at first. Their interactions remained brief but meaningful, a smile, a nod, a word, here and there. But it was clear that something unspoken was forming between them, a bond that wasn't based on grand gestures or desperate attempts to fill the emptiness. It was simply companionship, a mutual understanding that neither one needed to say much. To know they were both healing, both seeking something more than what they had before. One afternoon, as Stella sipped her usual cup of tea by the window, she noticed Alexander watching her from across the room. This time, his gaze lingered a little longer than usual. When he caught her eye, he raised his hand in a small, casual wave. It was the kind of wave that said, "I see you, I'm here." And for the first time, Stella didn't shy away from the contact. She smiled back, her heart lightening in a way she hadn't expected. Their connection was subtle at first, like a thread that had been slowly woven into place. One day, after weeks of their usual quiet greetings, Alexander finally approached her table. His footsteps were soft, measured, but there was a certain purpose in the way he walked toward her. When he reached her, he simply asked, "Would you like to join me for lunch today?" The invitation was unexpected, but not unwelcome. It wasn't the kind of forceful request that felt like an intrusion. It was simple, genuine, as though he was offering her a moment of shared peace. Stella hesitated for only a second before nodding. "I'd like that," she said, her voice softer than usual. They sat together, the conversation flowing easily, as if they had known each other for much longer than they really had. They talked about books, about their lives, about the small, quiet joys they found in the world around them. For the first time in a long while, Stella felt as though she could be herself, that she didn't have to put up a wall or hide behind a mask. Alexander listened intently, never pushing her to share more than she was ready to, but always making her feel heard. "Have you read Tower of Solitude?" he asked at one point, referring to the book he always carried with him. "It's a beautiful story. It's about finding connection in unexpected places." Stella nodded, her interest piqued. She hadn't read it, but the way he spoke about it made her want to. She found herself smiling at how thoughtful he was, how he seemed to notice the smallest things about her. For the first time in ages, she felt like someone saw her not as a victim, not as someone broken, but as just a person. And that was more than she had allowed herself to feel in a long time. In the weeks that followed, their meetings became more frequent. Sometimes it was at the restaurant, sometimes they would take walks in the nearby park or grab coffee at a little cafe Stella had come to love. They didn't rush into anything. They simply enjoyed each other's company, savoring the moments. That felt light and easy. With Alexander, there was no pressure, no expectation. There was only presence, his quiet, calming presence that allowed Stella to feel safe again, but safety was not something that came easily to her. It was a foreign concept, one that had been stolen from her in the past. There were moments when the old fears would surface, when the shadows of her past relationship would threaten to overwhelm her. But Alexander, ever patient, never pushed her. He respected her space, her boundaries, and allowed her to set the pace. He knew she wasn't ready for anything beyond friendship, and that was okay. One sunny afternoon, as they sat on a park bench, watching the children play on the carousel, Stella found the courage to speak the truth she had been holding back. It wasn't easy. The words felt heavy in her chest, like stones that she had carried for too long. But she knew she had to say it. "Alexander," she began, her voice hesitant but steady, "I need to tell you something. I'm not ready to get involved with anyone, not yet. There are things from my past that I'm still processing. I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to let them go." She didn't go into details. She didn't need to. He understood, as if he had already known the depth of what she wasn't saying. "I understand," he replied softly, his hand brushing hers gently. "And I'm in no rush. I'm here, Stella, whenever you're ready." There was no disappointment in his eyes, only warmth, only patience. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of something deeper, something that told Stella he would be there for her, even if it took time. It was the first time in a long while that Stella had felt like she could trust someone, not just with her heart, but with her healing. A few weeks later, after a movie at the local cinema, something shifted between them. They were walking back to the restaurant when Stella, without thinking, took the step that had eluded her for so long. She opened up. She shared the darkest parts of her past, the words, the insults, the fear that had kept her prisoner for so long. She told him about the toxic relationship, about how it had nearly destroyed her. When she finished, she expected him to pity her, to say something that would make her feel even more fragile. But instead, he simply looked at her with quiet admiration. "Thank you for trusting me," he said, his voice soft and sure. "You're stronger than you think, Stella." His words, gentle and kind, settled into her heart. They didn't erase the pain, but they gave her something she had been missing for so long: belief in herself. Time passed, and with it, Stella began to truly heal. She started going back to the gym, regaining the strength she had lost. She returned to work, even if only part-time at first. And all the while, Alexander remained a steady presence in her life. They spent evenings together, shared quiet moments, and talked about everything and nothing. And then, one evening, everything changed. They had gone to a new restaurant, a French-themed place that was soft and intimate. It was one of those nights where everything felt perfect. The music was gentle, the light was warm, and the atmosphere was filled with a quiet magic. But as they sat at their table, enjoying each other's company, Stella noticed him. Her ex sitting a few tables away with friends. The sight of him, the sight of the man who had once been her greatest source of fear, sent a chill down Stella's spine. Her heart began to race, her hands grew cold. She could feel the old anxiety creeping up on her, the panic, the terror of what he might do. Before she could react, Alexander noticed her discomfort. "Do you want to leave?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. But before Stella could respond, her ex had already stood up and started walking toward them, fists clenched, anger in his eyes. Stella froze. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. But then, just as quickly, Alexander stepped in front of her, positioning himself between Stella and her ex. The impact was small, but enough to stop the confrontation before it could escalate. Her ex froze, recognizing Alexander immediately. "Detective Dankworth," he stammered, his face paling. Stella watched in stunned silence as Alexander, with calm authority, said, "I suggest you return to your table and leave us alone, Mr. Mendez. There's no need for any trouble tonight." With that, her ex quickly retreated, his head bowed in fear. The weight of the situation was not lost on Stella. She realized, with a mix of shock and relief, that she was safe, truly safe. Later that night, when they were back at Stella's apartment, Alexander revealed the truth. "I'm a detective," he said quietly. "I work in a department that deals with crimes against women. Your ex, he's not someone you ever need to worry about again." Stella was speechless, overwhelmed by the realization that Alexander had been there all along, unbeknownst to her, offering her protection and safety when she didn't even know she needed it. Months passed, and their bond grew deeper. One day, on the second anniversary of their first meeting, Alexander led Stella to Nono's Corner, the restaurant where it had all begun. As they sat together, he smiled at her with that familiar sparkle in his eyes. "Remember when I said you'd have to become my wife?" he asked, his voice light but filled with affection. "I still stand by that prediction." Stella, her heart overflowing with emotion, could barely contain her tears. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of joy. "Yes, I'll be yours." And with that, the fear, the pain, and the uncertainty of the past faded into the distance. Stella had finally found her place in the world, and it was with Alexander by her side. Together they would face whatever the future held, with the knowledge that love, trust, and safety could be rebuilt, no matter how broken the past had been.